What up, Matt Kaiser here. Now, it's no secret that Final Fantasy 9 Remake is arguably one of the worst kept secrets in all of gaming.
That's putting it mildly, 007.
But it's been a big debate whether or not if Final Fantasy 9 Remake should exist, given that the original game is still a beloved classic, and for the most part, it has held up very well, especially on modern platforms, and especially if you play the PC version with older mods, it basically becomes a better remaster than the HD port we got. However, while a very strong argument, I've actually made a conclusion with some very good friends of mine that I got for this video that Final Fantasy 9 Remake does need to exist and does have potential. So, in this collab, I brought two special guests with me to talk about why we think Final Fantasy 9 Remake has the potential. But before we begin, if you like what you're seeing here, by all means, like the video, click the subscribe button if you're new, and hit that notification icon if you want more Final Fantasy 9 Remake content from yours truly. With that said, let's get back to the video. So in this video, I collected two special guests of mine, that be Limitless and Dukey, and we're each going to provide our own take about what Final Fantasy 9 Remake does have the potential, with some questions that I came up with, and they're going to answer it for me, and I'm going to give you my own take. So with that said, let's get straight out to the questions and the introductions of our special guests here.
Hey, how you guys doing? I'm Limitless. So there has been much talk about an FF9 remake being in development for, years at this point, right? Nothing that gives us any reason to doubt its existence unless, of course, it was quietly canned behind the scenes.
Hey everyone, Dukey03 here, and I am pleased to take part in this collab with Mad Kaiser, and he's got a couple questions for us that I am going to do my best to answer. I think personally, next to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX probably has the biggest and most passionate fan base in the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy IX is tied with Final Fantasy IV as my personal favorite in the series, and to me, Final Fantasy IX embodies all of what the classic Final Fantasy games are and stand for. There's so many throwback references to the previous entries in the series. Final Fantasy IX also happens to be Hironobu Sakaguchi's favorite entry in the franchise, so do I think it's the right call that they're remaking this game? Abso-freaking-lutely.
FF9 has been chosen as the next remake for Final Fantasy, and not, 8 or 10 or really any other older game in the series. Well, to put it simply, I actually think it's a calculated choice to do so. You see, with the 7 remake being much more ambitious and broader in scope, stretching what it means to be a remake, remaking FF9 could be a stark contrast to that in every way. It's an opportunity for Square Enix to provide a more one-to-one faithful adaptation where everyone can experience FF9 as it was, just bigger and better. Not to mention that Final Fantasy IX is such a different visual style to any Final Fantasy that helps it stand out from the rest, almost like a Studio Ghibli anime art style that could probably capture the eyes of more kids and teens, especially now that anime has such a huge cultural impact here in the West. But there's also another reason why this Final Fantasy IX remake could have been chosen first, which just leads into our
Pretty good answers, I have to say. As for my take, why I think Final Fantasy 9 Remake has been taking a higher priority over any other mainline game is two things. One of which is that Final Fantasy 9 is currently the most popular Final Fantasy game out there. I mean, it's currently the highest rated mainline single player Final Fantasy game, especially on Metacritic, and there's just been a lot of reverence towards Final Fantasy 9 in general. Even if, initially when it first came out, some people felt lukewarm to it, given the fact that it was very different to what came before, especially Final Fantasy 7 and 8. But regardless, I do think that its popularity has given the right call, and also given the fact that Final Fantasy 9 original was being done by a different team opposed to the Final Fantasy 7 and 8 team. And those people that made those two games are currently working on the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, and they're currently doing the final chapter of that game, and that's the main reason why we haven't seen say a Final Fantasy 6, 8 or 10 remake yet. Let alone also we had both the Final Fantasy 3 and 4 remake, so there's really not much of a next choice of what Final Fantasy game deserves a remake. I mean, there could be also a Final Fantasy 1, 2 and 5 remake, but the former two don't hold much interest, if I'm going to be completely honest. And 5, while still a great game, it's very overlooked and very underrated, and I don't think a lot of people would find profitability into doing so. So I do think that's the reason why Final Fantasy 9 Remake is the one that has taken more priority over here.
So I don't personally know who's working on Final Fantasy 9 Remake. I do know that it has been worked on and then passed on to another team due to either creative differences or the team that was originally set to work on it just not being up to the task. It's giving me anxiety, to say the least. I absolutely love Final Fantasy 9, and I really don't want them to kind of drop the ball with this project, but currently it's kind of looking like it might go that way. It feels like it's been in development hell, personally.
Now, the team I think has been made in charge of this remake is Dukey03. Same team who's been developing Final Fantasy XIV, 16, and now the most recently Final Fantasy Tactics: The Evil East Chronicles. And you may be asking, isn't this too much for them to take on? To which I will say, no, not really. You see, Dukey03 has only grown throughout the years, and while yes, it is not as big as another internal studio at Square Enix like Creative Studio 1, who works on Final Fantasy VII and Kingdom Hearts, this is still an extremely efficient studio at Square Enix who is no stranger to balancing projects. When you take into account that FF14's latest expansion, Dawn Trail, is just one massive FF9 reference, and the fact that, Creative Studio 3 is the Final Fantasy team most familiar with and known for the more classic medieval-inspired Final Fantasy games compared to CS1. I mean, when you really think about it, it does make the most sense for it to be the 14 team developing 9 Remake. This is a studio who is not shy to point out how much they adore the pixel era of Final Fantasy, which directly inspired Final Fantasy 9. And additionally, it's not only Sakaguchi's favorite Final Fantasy game, but Creative Studio 3 is heavily involved with him, and both him and Yoshi P are close business partners and friends. Most recently, the studio helped Sakaguchi remaster and port his original game Fantasian to all modern platforms. It's important to note, however, that Yoshi P in an interview around the time Dawn Trail released did touch on this heavily rumored game, saying that even if there was a remake, he wouldn't be the one working on it directly. Of course, devs do this all the time to keep things under wraps and not to give anything away, regardless of what they're saying is actually true or not. But even if what Yoshi P is saying is the truth and he's not actually directing or producing this remake, that doesn't necessarily confirm that Creative Studio 3 itself isn't behind the project. As Final Fantasy Tactics: The Evil East Chronicles has shown us, while Yoshi P is the head of the studio, he doesn't need to be directly or heavily involved for these studios to branch out and remaster or remake these games. So with everything that we know, and everything that the studio has been up to since Final Fantasy 16, I don't think it's outlandish to think that it is Creative Studio 3 working on this 9 remake.
I have to say, those are some pretty good answers for what is possibly my most complicated and tough question I had to write when making this. Now, as for me, I have actually 3 possible outcomes. One of which is that Final Fantasy 9 Remake is being done by an external studio, an outsourced one, and there are 2 that come into my mind. One would have to be Art Piazza, that done like say the Super Mario RPG remake, as well as various other Dragon Quest games, and the other one being Zine, that gave us the Trials of Mana remake, as well as the Sakura Wars reboot, as well as also partially collabing with P Studio to give us Persona 3 Reload, and also the Romancing Saga 2 remake. I think either of them probably will be qualified to do a Final Fantasy 9 remake if the rumors are true of it being more traditional and faithful, and of course more one-to-one than say Final Fantasy 7. Now, if the rumors are true that it was shifted to being outsourced to a more in-house team, then that leaves me with other 2 outcomes, one of which would have to be Creative Studio 3, which Limitless gave a good point, as obviously Creative Studio 3 has been growing in size in terms of employees, and they had their work cut out for them given the fact that not only do they make the big games like say Final Fantasy 16 as well as Final Fantasy 14, but they have also been delving into small projects, as we see in the case of Fantasia Dimension and of course the Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster. And even though Yoshi P did say that he probably isn't the one that's doing the Final Fantasy 9 remake, it's not to say that anyone else from Creative Studio 3 isn't doing it, as obviously Yoshi P doesn't have involvement with the Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster, so it does seem very possible that it could be someone from Creative Studio 3, given of course the aforementioned growing size of employees and the amount of teams that would be able to make it, so that is a very strong possibility. And even if Yoshi P may be telling the truth, he could also bend the truth for all we know, so I do think it could be Creative Studio 3. But if it isn't Creative Studio 3, I think the other possible choice that I think no one is paying no mind except for one person is, well, Creative Studio 2, which is actually another off-branch of the original Creative Studio 1, Creative Business Unit 1, which has actually been led by Yoshinori Kitase and Motomo Toriyama. And the reason I say this is mainly because, due to their efforts and what their latest project is, we currently don't know, as most of the games that they've been doing are sort of the saga games, and obviously with Final Fantasy 7 Remake as well as also Kingdom Hearts 4, that's being done by Creative Studio 1, so for Creative Studio 2's case, they could be the ones doing the Final Fantasy 9 Remake, as I think that would be a lot more easier and obviously not much of an undertaking to do. Given also the matter is that, well, Yoshinori Kitase did once tease that there was a big major announcement that was unrelated to Final Fantasy 7 that he can't wait to announce yet. And it's been now over 2 years since he said that, and we still haven't learned what that announcement is. Now, obviously it could be, outlandish for him to do a Final Fantasy 9 remake, given the fact that he wasn't involved in the original, but he's still the brand manager of Final Fantasy in general, so maybe he could be involved in some capacity. Though I do hope with my last video that Final Fantasy 9 Remake is being, handled correctly with the right amount of dev people and the right amount of talent, even involving talent that once worked with the original Final Fantasy 9, like of course Toshiyuki Itahana and Hiroki Ito, two people who still work within Square Enix even. And obviously, even Sakaguchi came back to Creative Studio 3 to help do his Fantasia Neo Dimension Remaster, so that adds a little bit of credibility if Creative Studio 3 were the ones to handle it.
I think if it's done properly, a Final Fantasy remake would be the perfect entry point to the series. Like I said, Final Fantasy IX is an excellent kind of representation of what Final Fantasy is. To me, there's kind of like two different types of Final Fantasies. There's like your medieval fantasy kind of world exploring Final Fantasy game with knights and mages and all that good stuff. And then there's the kind of like steampunky, cyberpunky side. Final Fantasy IX to me is like the pinnacle representation of what Final Fantasy 1 up to Final Fantasy 5 was. And to people like me who kind of grew up loving the classics, this would be just absolutely incredible and a really good jumping on point. People that maybe aren't wanting to play something with pixel graphics would enter the series with this Final Fantasy IX remake, and then once they hear about how many like throwbacks that this game has to the classics, they might actually take a look back and try out some of the pixel remasters. I think that'd be a good thing for the series.
So do I think this FF9 remake would serve as a good starting point for newcomers to the series? Not only am I gonna say yes, but I'm gonna say that this remake has the potential to be the best starting point of the franchise. More than 7 Remake, 16, or really any other modern titles. And let me explain. Because it's been rumored that this remake will be a much more faithful adaptation, as I said earlier, that means everyone will be able to experience Final Fantasy IX as it was, but just better. A return to form that reintroduces the classic formula of the series, but just iterated on. This isn't a 7 Remake situation where you're not actually experiencing the classic story and game as it was because, well, it's not a traditional remake. With the prospect that this game will stick much closer to the original, everyone will simply be on the same page in experiencing the definitive version of 9, not told through parts or told in a different way, but simply given to us through one full remake.
Once again, you guys provide some really good takes. Now, I think Final Fantasy IX Remake does serve as potential for a good newcomer Final Fantasy entry. Given, obviously, with the debate that Final Fantasy has lost its identity and has failed to attract newcomers, especially now with the newer games post Final Fantasy X, as all of those games play drastically different from each other, so it's really hard to know what to expect from those games. And while the 7 Remake trilogy is being widely beloved because it has that winning gameplay formula that's very unique, currently that's still being only used for the Final Fantasy 7 Remake trilogy and not anything else regarding Final Fantasy, which is a bit of a shame and something I do hope that does change to happen. So I do think that Final Fantasy IX Remake is potentially a good newcomer Final Fantasy, given the fact that if the rumors are true that it is so faithful to the original Final Fantasy IX, which was still a classic ATB turn-based game, which in of itself paid tribute to other classic Final Fantasy ATB turn-based games and even ones before that, I do think that obviously if Final Fantasy IX Remake does well, it could let players obviously try out some of the other classic Final Fantasy games, like say Final Fantasy 1 through 6, or the original 7, 8, and even 9, and even Final Fantasy X, as all of those games had, a more consistent gameplay formula that the new ones currently lack. And obviously Final Fantasy IX itself was meant to be a tribute to the classic Final Fantasies from 1 through 6, which is honestly really touching, and honestly I think it's the one that currently represents Final Fantasy the best really. It's the last stand of what made Final Fantasy currently so popular ever since 7 drove up the series to new heights even. So I think if people really like Final Fantasy IX Remake, that would definitely make them want to check out the other classic Final Fantasy games.
I think Final Fantasy IX has a ton of potential for a remake. I mean, the original game in and of itself is almost perfect in my opinion, but I would like to see things cleaned up. I would like to see what they could do with it visually. I'd love to see them keep that original style, that kind of art style, but just like evolve it. We've seen the figures for the Final Fantasy IX 25th anniversary, and I would really like the graphics of this remake to kind of encompass that style, and I think it will. I think those figures honestly are based off of what they've got so far for the remake project, and if so, I'll be very, very happy with it. I mean, even if they just use like the models that they used in Final Fantasy Dissidia NT, that's basically all we're looking for, is Final Fantasy IX with the original story and just the updated graphics, what all remakes should be, if you know what I mean. Thanks for having me, Mad Kaiser. You guys can check me out here on YouTube, youtube.com/Dukey03.
Does this Final Fantasy IX Remake have potential? Yeah, it absolutely does. This could be the game that really marks a rebirth for the series in a positive way. To help Square Enix gauge where to take the series going forward, especially after reintroducing a classic formula the series had all those years ago. And we haven't had a modern Final Fantasy that simply goes back to that style of game. That ATB turn-based combat, the classic globe-trotting overworld style of exploration. We haven't had that type of classic JRPG game design in a Final Fantasy for way too long. And so I honestly don't think it would hurt for Square Enix to revisit that again, especially for a remake. It can be that entry in the series that unites the fan base in a much more positive way than any of the modern Final Fantasy games, because it simply trusts in its gameplay roots. And to me, that is all I want to see from the series. I mean, regardless of the gameplay formula, build on and trust in what the series already has rather than looking to other games to find that success. I've already said this in a lot of my own videos, but Final Fantasy already has the secret sauce. They just gotta learn how to actually use it and iterate on it instead of going and creating something entirely new every single game. Anyways, let me know what you guys think about it down below. Even though this Final Fantasy IX Remake may not be as grand or as ambitious in scale, I honestly do believe this has that potential to unify this fandom in a way that no other modern Final Fantasy has. Whether it's a game that actually brings back that classic gameplay formula, it gives us that ATB combat, and gives us a game that just returns to that traditional JRPG style. style. You know, all of it remains to be seen, but I would really love for that type of game to make it into the series again. Anyway, with all of that said, it is back to your host.
And thank you once again for Dukey and Limitless for providing their final answers for my final question. Now before we wrap up, I'm going to list down my final answer for this question. And yes, I do think Final Fantasy IX Remake has the potential, mainly to be the opportunity, the greatest opportunity for Square Enix to return to turn-based for modern Final Fantasy, as that's something they have recently abandoned ever since post Final Fantasy X, and that has caused a split and divide with the fanbase, not helped with the fact that, as mentioned, Final Fantasy seems to have lost its identity recently, especially when it comes to gameplay and its consistency, as each mainline game post 10 plays very different from each other, and they haven't found a winning formula compared to the classic Final Fantasy from 1 to 3, to 4 to 9, to even 10, which is a real shame. And while I do think Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy's combat is a step in the right direction for a new mainline FF, I still feel like there's room to do a modern turn-based Final Fantasy. Not to also mention that even though Square Enix does make turn-based games with Bravely Default, Octopath, Dragon Quest, and Saga, there's obviously, you know, that specific need for the classic Final Fantasy combat to return within a brand new game. And I think that's something that the veterans will be happy about, especially if they keep feeling alienated with new entries. And if you don't still believe that, I mean, look at, you know, modern turn-based JRPGs as they are now. Obviously we have Persona and Yakuza Like a Dragon being well received because of how well both their turn-based systems are, as well as obviously on how great games they are in general. And even Western RPGs like Baldur's Gate 3 or even Club Skill Expedition 33 have really shown on how great a modern turn-based game can really do, especially in the modern age. But even still, even the niche side of things like say Octopath, Bravely Default, and other niche JRPG series that still do turn-based, they still sell really well for what they are, especially if their budgets aren't as huge as like say Final Fantasy 16 or 7 Rebirth. So I think there's still room for, you know, a modern turn-based Final Fantasy RPG to have, especially since, you know, other companies that sort of shift different directions and gameplay styles for their long-running franchises can still make, you know, a game that is still catered to the veterans that will make them very happy. Look at Yakuza, for example, as well as both Nintendo has made two sides of both 2D and 3D Mario, as well as Zelda and Metroid, all of those that can peacefully coexist for both fans and newcomers alike, and that's something that Final Fantasy should not, you know, be shy of. They should still obviously do something to, you know, cater to the new fans while still pleasing with the old audience. So I do think if, for example, if they make, you know, a classic Final Fantasy turn-based game that is for veterans, I think they will absolutely love it, and I think it would actually do well, especially if the story also nails and the RPG mechanics are very well handled. And I think that's what Final Fantasy IX Remake should be. It should be the last beacon of hope, the last thing that should potentially return Final Fantasy in a way back to turn-based, as so many fans have been desperately wanting to. And thank you guys for watching this wonderful collab that I've made, and special thanks to my guests both Dukey and Limitless for being part of this collab. It was an honor working with them, and if you love Final Fantasy or JRPG content, then please check their videos, let alone channels out. They make some wonderful content, and honestly, they are so worth it, and I'm honestly glad for them to be part of this collab. So let us know down in the comments if you believe a potential for the Final Fantasy IX Remake, if it does happen, and whether or not you think it does need to exist, or whether you think they don't need to make it. Please let us know of what you guys think of this video, let alone the possibility of a Final Fantasy IX Remake. And until then, special thanks to my patrons, and Mad Kaiser, out.